The U.S. airstrike on Iran's top general, a failure of diplomacy or enforcing it? What's Trump's red line on Iran? This is America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. Well, I've been away covering the elections in Taiwan. Did anything big happen while I was gone?
Breaking news. In a major escalation in tensions between the U.S. and Iran, the top Iranian general has been killed in an airstrike while leaving the Baghdad airport. The Pentagon confirmed the U.S. military carried out the attack.
The aftermath shows an attack that was deliberate and sustained.
Soleimani was plotting imminent and sinister attacks on American diplomats and military personnel.
He's now taken us to the precipice of war, and we may actually end up in a war.
Wait, are we at war? Yeah, hold on, don't tell me. I'm still catching up on the news, and I hate spoilers. Now, everyone's got their hot take about the killing of Soleimani. You can probably guess what it is, depending on where they fall on the political spectrum. The debate isn't about whether Soleimani was a good guy. No one is arguing that. Okay, Russians are arguing that. But the real problem here is an inconsistent U.S. policy on Iran, which has been going on for decades. Okay, the real problem here is actually a repressive Iranian regime that's trying to dominate the entire Middle East, but this isn't Iran Uncovered. I feel kind of bad for the Iranian regime. It's hard for brutal authoritarian regimes to figure out U.S. politics. First, we have one guy in power who says one thing, then a few years later, a guy who says something completely different. Then a few years later, another guy who says something even more different. What's a supreme leader to do? President Obama signs a nuclear deal with you, and then the next guy just blows it up. And this is why diplomacy with Iran is hard. I mean, other than the fact that Iran said diplomacy with the U.S. is over. And that was from December, before Trump told Soleimani he was fired. Too soon? Diplomacy requires a consistent and clear red line. We'll negotiate and try to resolve our differences peacefully, but if you do X, there will be consequences. Problems happen when the red line is crossed and there are no consequences. Take, for example, the Scarborough Shoal. That's territory in the South China Sea claimed by the Philippines and China. President Obama told Chinese leadership any occupation of the shoal would cross a red line. And then in 2012, the Chinese regime occupied the Scarborough Shoal. And there were no consequences. Today, China's communist regime has built several artificial islands in the South China Sea capable of housing nuclear bombers and armed them with anti-ship missiles. The red line was not enforced, so the Chinese regime felt like it could get away with anything. And now the situation is much harder to resolve. The same is true for Iran. Over the past year, the Iranian regime has become increasingly aggressive. There was the attack on oil tankers in May. In June, Iran shot down a U.S. drone. In July, a British oil tanker was seized. In September, Iran was likely behind the attack on two Saudi Arabian state-run oil companies. And each time, the U.S. response was muted. But there was a red line, drawn in the place all major U.S. policy decisions are made these days: Twitter. In June 2019, after Iran shot down a U.S. drone, Trump tweeted, "Any attack by Iran on anything American will be met with great and overwhelming force. In some areas, overwhelming will mean obliteration." But you can see why Iran might not take a U.S. red line very seriously. I mean, does the Supreme Leader even tweet? What's that, Shelley? Yes, he does. He tweets about America's venomous daggers. I love Twitter. To be fair, the Trump administration didn't just use Twitter. Last summer, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned Iranian officials that any attack by Tehran or its proxies resulting in the death of even one American service member will generate a military counterattack. But back to how the Supreme Leader doesn't take the U.S. leader seriously. At the end of December, an American contractor was killed by an Iranian-backed militia group in Iraq, and 11 U.S. servicemen were injured. The Pentagon came to Trump with a list of options, including killing Soleimani. Trump did what he's best known for: showing restraint. Instead of killing Soleimani, he ordered airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. In response, the Iranian-backed militia group in Iraq and Soleimani incited an attack on the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. And then the U.S. had to respond to that. And Soleimani found out the hard way that the red line really had been crossed. But given the history, you can understand why Iran probably felt they could cross the red line and nothing would happen. And with massive internal protests, plus protests in Lebanon and Iraq against Iran-backed governments, the regime felt it was probably worth attacking U.S. assets, partly to distract protesters and partly because they believed the U.S. was behind the protests in the first place. I mean, the U.S. probably wouldn't do anything in response, right? But it did at least channel Iranians' anger away from the regime to the United States, at least according to a lot of American media.
Tonight, hundreds of thousands of mourners pouring onto the streets of Iran, a massive display of defiance towards the United States for the killing of General Qasem Soleimani, as members of parliament chant "Death to America."
But if you avoid Iranian state-run media, you might have a different perspective, like the large number of Iranians who support the U.S.'s killing of Soleimani. They say they don't believe their regime's propaganda. The government has forced students and officials to attend the Soleimani memorial. It provided free transport and ordered shops to shut down. According to videos sent to me by people inside the country, the authorities are making little kids write essays praising the fallen commander. First graders who didn't know how to write were encouraged to cry for Soleimani. The reality is, during protests in Iran over the past several months, Iranian security forces killed more than 1,500 people. And they've arrested around 7,000 people. So there's not as much love lost for Soleimani as the regime would like people to think. And at this Iranian university, the majority of students can be seen carefully avoiding walking on the American and Israeli flags that someone had painted to try and make them step on them. So this whole anti-American thing is not actually working out so well for the Iranian regime. And after they accidentally shot down that Ukrainian airplane, killing 176 people, they've had more protests to worry about. Meanwhile, Trump has once again taken to Twitter to reiterate a new red line. Let this serve as a warning that if Iran strikes any Americans or American assets, Iran will be hit very fast and very hard. By talking about American assets, does that mean military action will be taken if Iran shoots down a U.S. drone? It didn't in June. Maybe that's changed. But we won't know for sure unless Iran tries to cross another red line. So what do you think? Leave your comments below. And please remember to support this show on the crowdfunding website Patreon. YouTube demonetizes a lot of our videos and would have run the show out of business if it weren't for your support. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.